What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the PFN Scouting Podcast. We took a break for 1 week, but we are back. It is May. That 2024 NFL Draft is in the rearview mirror, and we're going to start to transition to the 2025 NFL Draft cycle. A lot of fun with that, but first, today's episode going to be a fun one. We're going to let loose a little bit, going to kind of loosen up and just talk about the process. Broad scale. What do you do when you're transitioning from one cycle to the next? How do you, impact your grading scale? What changes do you make? How do you reevaluate? So a lot of fun stuff. But first off, I got to ask Derek, how you doing? Because you were working last week. I was on vacation. I hope you take some time to get vacation soon here. But how are you doing, Derek?
Oh, man, I took the time off for you anyway, to build a scouting profile for you. And taking a look at some of your work, and I counted on, I think, one scouting report that you did, like 37 adjectives, some of them hyphenated to be able to describe physical traits. And that just gives you an idea of how in-depth and how detailed you are being able to describe all these prospects. So I was doing a little bit of a scouting report on you while you were gone. You didn't know about it.
I didn't know about it. Yeah, that's surprising. What would you give my vernacular grade? I need a grade here. I need a number. I need a stat.
A plus. You are a wordsmith savant, my friend. When it comes to that, you are you're up there with your Edgar Allan Poes as far as being able to write in a scouting format. So quite impressive. But always glad to have you back and talk a little bit of ball.
I was still writing over break too. I'm actually writing a little book on the side, and I was able to get I was writing. I think I was able to wrote 7,000 words over break on that, so I was able to let loose on that too. I'm almost done with book one. Not going to spoil anything yet. But I think it's got legit potential. So that's also in the works there. But that's the thing, man. Even when I'm on break, I can't stop writing. It's weird. I have a problem. I really do. But it is what it is. We didn't just write. We didn't just work. I went to Wisconsin to visit a friend from high school, and we hung out a little bit. We got a little inebriated at times, but never, beyond reproach. And I stubbed my toe at one point. I don't really know how that happened, but we're good. I think it's just a sprain. We'll be fine. But it was a fun time. It was good to unwind a little bit and see the guys, and we went to the zoo at one point. But back to talk football, which is my favorite thing on the clock here. And I'm with my guy, Derek Tate, as well. We had a lot of great pre-draft content for the 2024 cycle, and we will continue to circle back as the offseason continues on. We know the rookies are getting action in camp, and the camp is going to continue August, the preseason, all of that. That's going to bring a ton of new talking points for us to explore and ultimately see how those guys progress. But today, things are pretty light. So we're going to open up a little bit and talk about the scouting process, because I think there's a lot of in-depth, a lot of things inside the weeds that go not overlooked, but you can't go in depth with everything during the draft cycle. So now we can open up a bit. So Derek, I just got to ask you right away, after the 2024 NFL draft concludes, after we see these players land in their different spots, what's the first step for you transitioning over to the 2025 cycle? What's the first thing you do?
Well, the first thing that I do transferring to the 2025 cycle is, we're kind of taking a look at where I'm kind of grading out players and my opinion on where I thought that they could have landed during the 2024 NFL draft, taking a closer look if I missed the mark, right? So there's a top 100 competition, and you did very well with that, trying to build out your top 100 board amongst industry professionals. And it's very interesting to see which guys landed in the top 100, which is where you had them graded out and expected them to land. And then there's the players that didn't go where we expected. Why is that? So I start looking at, someone like Jalen Coker for me, who I thought had day 3 written all over him. I thought he had a chance to potentially go as early as the 4th round, and he goes undrafted. Now he's with the Carolina Panthers. Why is that? Like, what in NFL circles and NFL personnel evaluators, what didn't they like about his profile? Why was I so much higher on him than, all 32 teams in the NFL? That's where I kind of like to take a look back, where some of these prospects landed. Another guy is Malik Washington that, fell all the way to the 6th round to the Miami Dolphins. You had him in your top 75, I think. I definitely had him in my top 75 as well. Expected him to be even a potentially late 2nd round pick, and he goes all the way to round 6. So kind of trying to take that process, one final look at where all these prospects landed. And I know we don't have the medicals, but just as far as the entire process goes, trying to take a closer look at maybe where I missed and why I missed, and trying to learn from it.
Yeah, I think that's the first step, obviously. And the other part of it is we haven't seen these guys hit the field yet, right? So we still don't know what's going to happen and what kind of outcomes their careers are going to unfold, right? But at the same time, how the NFL drafts and where players go is reflective of their value, right? Bo Braid from Maryland was another one for me, a top 100 player on my board at safety, one of my favorite safeties in the class, and he ended up going undrafted to the Eagles, I believe. So, you look at that. Anytime that there's a discrepancy between, your board and where a player goes, first thing you look at is what different ancillary factors could have led to this. Was it injuries? Was it, in Malik Washington's case, probably role, a lack of role versatility, probably going to be confined to the slot at the next level just with his build. So, once you pinpoint those things, or for Bo Braid, right, he ran a 4.66 40-yard dash, not the most explosive, not the fastest guy. Some of those things provide context that you need, right? And then from there, we can evaluate where these guys are going to go and how they're going to progress in their careers. But going undrafted or going later than expected is not a death knell for players. And we've seen that time and time again, right? Puka Nacua going around 5 last year, ended up having probably the best rookie season in wide receiver history, right? Another one, Keaton Mitchell from Baltimore, was a fringe top 100 guy for me, and he ended up going undrafted. And unfortunately, his season got cut short to injury. But for a little bit there, man, he was a really, really fun spark plug for the Ravens. And if he can get back to full health, could continue within that role alongside Derrick Henry. So, the draft capital and the landing spots and where these players go, that's just the first step of the equation, right? And it's important not to get too hasty, but at the same time, as an evaluator, that is something you have to internalize. Like, these teams saw something that maybe I didn't see. And, how can I integrate that a little bit better in the next cycle? And you could end up being right too. That's another thing. So you got to be patient with it, but you also have to acknowledge the spread of outcomes and the probability spread that is, included in the process. So that's the first thing you look at for sure. You look at the discrepancies. Now, how do you transition that back to your grading scale and your evaluation process, right? Because that's the next step for me, right? You look at where these players go, you look at the discrepancies, and you can do that, but you can only do so much with that before we see them on the field. At a certain point, you just got to step back and say, we just got to see what happens, right? But there is something you can do proactively as an evaluator in the offseason, and that's look at your grading scale and where you might stand to change things, right? Like with my scale in particular, I always do an audit of my trait weights. I assign different weights to different traits, like quarterback, arm elasticity, arm strength, processing. Those are the top ones, right? And then you go down to other ones like mechanics. Those are important too, and all the weights are pretty close to even. But I break up my traits in certain categories, how developmental they are, and then how important they are for success at that position, right? So if a trait is absolutely important, absolutely vital, I call that an integral trait. Then I have preferred traits, which are preferred but not the most important, and then secondary traits, which are, you want to have a weight for them, but they're secondary to success. Run blocking for receivers is one example of that. And then the other one, I have developmental or intrinsic traits, traits that you can't really develop. They're kind of just given to a player, right? Correct. Explosion, speed. Some guys have it, some guys don't. That's pretty much, usually the athletic traits are going to be on that intrinsic side. Developmental, it's hard to develop at the NFL level, but just because they can be developed, that's going to decrease the weight for me a little bit because a prospect does have the ability to improve it at the NFL level. So I look at my traits within those two windows, and then I audit my grading scale for each position and see which weights maybe stand to improve. One example from a couple cycles ago, when Quentin Johnson came out, right? I had a very big grade on him, and I think I've talked about this a couple of times in the pod, but I had a really big grade on him, man, and he did underwhelm in his first year. So that was a big learning lesson for me, looking at my scale, rolling over to the 2024 cycle, where I'm like, okay, maybe route running and hand technique, maybe I need to stop projecting for upside so much and actually, scrutinize more heavily, prospects that do have that. Because the NFL level, you need to separate, you need to catch the ball. Like, that's kind of wide receiver 101, right? So, auditing the grading scale is such a big part of it for me. And I've gotten to a place now, 3 to 4 years in, full time anyway, where I don't have to make a lot of changes. I'm pretty close to the sweet spot and where I want to be, but there's always more to learn. There's always more to improve, and there's always more to reevaluate year over year. So that's the next biggest part for me. You got a grading scale. How do you rework it? What do you look at?
Well, definitely the physical traits is something that it's just kind of there. And I like how you worded it. And that's kind of how I frame my prospect profile as well, is like there's physical traits and, explosive metrics. A lot of those testing metrics are uncovered or discovered or confirmed, during the pre-snap or pre-draft process, right? It's those other intricate details that make it a little bit different. Like, you have to go back and kind of tip the scale a little bit, maybe reassess how you go in and value a certain skill set. For me, I didn't think Bo Nix was a first round quarterback talent. I thought he was more maybe late first, if not, I thought him more of a day 2 prospect. And there he goes at 12 overall to the Denver Broncos. So I go back and I look and go, well, what was I not valuing that Bo Nix does, at a higher level? And maybe it's the anticipation aspect of it, because I did see a lot of examples where Bo Nix threw with anticipation when operating on his first read. A lot of the confines of that Oregon offense, and I've gotten in trouble in the past with trying to project that Oregon offense to the NFL, cough, cough, Justin Herbert, that have gotten me in trouble in the past. So I'm going, okay, maybe Sean Payton is valuing how he gets the ball out of his hands quickly to his first read and how he can throw it into small anticipation windows, and it's on film, which means Sean Payton feels confident that if he can throw with anticipation and it's there on tape, that can translate to his offense in the NFL, right? So, but then I look at, how often was Bo Nix going through full field reads and going through his progressions and getting off of that first primary read? Am I valuing that too much? So it's kind of going back and taking a look at some of those, players that went a little bit higher in the draft that I didn't see coming. Same thing with maybe Michael Penix, who I thought was more of a mid to late first round, and he goes number 8 overall to a team that doesn't really need a quarterback in 2024. Going back and really going through with a fine-tooth comb and maybe tweaking my process as far as what skill sets and traits that I value that aren't just on the physical plane or like on the physical profile. Because a lot of times the arm talent, the arm elasticity, as you mentioned before, like you can see those on tape, right? Can a guy throw off platform? Can he drop his arm angle? Does the ball still come out with velocity when everything is not tied down perfectly and he has to move off platform? Those are things that I feel like I can see pretty clearly on tape. It's more so the mental processing of it that I really do a deep dive as far as the quarterbacks go, because there's so much pre-snap information. We know the concept. It's easy for us to sit here in an armchair and kind of go back with a clicker and dissect, okay, well, why didn't he get to his second read here a little bit quicker when there's so much information to process at the quarterback position? That's always one that's very fluid for me, is how I grade out quarterbacks. And every single year, I feel like I get a little bit more information and kind of retool that process based off of where some of these prospects land. Yeah, and processing for QBs is so unique because, again, there is so much information to take in on any given down, man. It's insane, and I think that's another thing that's important too. When you're transitioning, understanding that, for any given cycle, there's more that you can integrate and kind of include in your grade. Like 2 years ago, I won't mince words, Derek. or 3 years ago, I guess. I've gotten a little bit better over time. But 3 or 4 years ago, like when the Josh Rosen came out, I think that might have been 5 now. It's crazy how time flies. But I was trash at QB evaluating, man. I was awful. It was absurd. I was just like, man, I kind of like this guy. All right, he's my guy. I'm planting my flag. It's like, no, Ian, don't do that. Come on, what are you doing? But the more that you have that learning mindset and understanding how complex the game of football is, that's kind of how you start to expand your process, right? And then now, before I went on vacation, I was watching some QBs, and the biggest thing is that processing, there's so much that falls into that bucket, right? I mean, pre-snap, you got to be making checks. If you see a blitzing threat, how proactive is the QB? Does he have the autonomy at the line of scrimmage to make those changes? Does he make the right changes, right? And, even if he doesn't, I still like the autonomy. I still like the effort, especially for a young guy, right? But then even after the snap, I mean, you're not just processing the field. You're trying to feel where the pressure is coming from. If there's a free blitzer, how do you adjust to that to keep your eyes upfield? Do you drop your eyes? And then there are different types of windows and different types of anticipation too. That was a big thing for me going back to Kenny Pickett, right? In 2022, everyone was asking, most people had him as a mid to late day 2 at best, right? We were pretty much, there was generally an agreement that he wasn't worth round 1 capital, and there wasn't any consensus of any of those QBs were worth round 1 capital. But Kenny Pickett was one. I identified him pretty early as a potential early round guy. I think it was the year before even. I thought there was enough talent there, but that was one where I kind of got
once I identified him, I was like, yes, he can be that guy. And there wasn't a lot of reevaluation on my part too. So that was one where I'll own up to it, because I think looking at the Senior Bowl tape was one example where there was a little bit of confirmation bias seeping in for me, where I saw him go from a first window to a second window read on just a short crosser, right? And it's like, oh, here's an example of anticipation. There, he anticipated the window. Very, very nice job, Kenny. Good job, Kenny. But then you realize, the more you learn about it and the more that you kind of free yourself from that confirmation bias, you really learn there are different levels of anticipation, right? Anticipating a window on a slant and a crosser. Like, yes, it's very good to have that, right? Especially when you're in rhythm in the pocket, but that's relatively easy compared to, cover 2 hole shot where you really need to have great timing on your drop back, 100%. Where you really need to have great layering as well, and even in the deep third as well. I think that there are different levels of anticipation based on the types of throws that you're making. Some examples are far more complex. And so you need to be able to discern and understand that and also make the adequate valuation with that too, because that can limit a quarterback's viability as an intermediate passer. And I think intermediate is probably the hardest part of the field to throw to, that 15 to 25, deep passes are tough too, but at least with the deep passes, once he gets past that deep safety, if he can at least get an angle there, you don't have as much reinforcements, right? In the intermediate level, you've got underneath guys, you've got safeties coming over top. There's so many layered coverage looks that fitting the ball into that area can be very tough. And that's the tough part too, because especially on, mid to long downs, like let's say 3rd and 7, 3rd and 11, second and 12, if you got a loss, right? Getting those chunks, those little chunks that can keep the offense moving and keep the engine humming, those are really tough to get, man. So, the more I think about it, that was a big thing for me. I think transitioning from cycle to cycle, not just kind of taking a hands-on approach with your grading scale and your weights, but also having the mental understanding to say, hey, there might be more that I'm not considering that I should, and there might be a different way that I need to think about this trait or something that I need to add to my, kind of my accounting of what to look for. And so I think that's another big part of it too, because football is a mental game. Football is a detail-oriented game. There's so much to take into account for every single position, every single trait. And so I think, beyond the grading scale modulation and modification, I think the expansion mindset is also very, very good to have. And it's
very, very much so. Yeah. Like Malik Willis, you're naming all kinds of things, and you bring up Kenny Pickett, Malik Willis, and even Matt Corral in that quarterback class. That specific one, there's a lot that I learned, right? So for me, when it came to Malik Willis, and we saw quarterbacks that maybe weren't the most polished prospects coming out as far as pure pocket passers, but if they got into the right situation, I could project that they could develop if I saw enough on tape to where I felt comfortable saying, okay, I saw it on tape, he can do it, right? Throw with a little anticipation. The problem is with Malik Willis, his working the middle of the field, in particular the intermediate portion of the field, was very, very thin, and I had to go maybe on 1 or 2 reps. Okay, I see it. I think he could do it, and maybe the right coaching staff can kind of harness that. But there was a lot of reps on tape where he would tuck the ball down unnecessarily. He wouldn't be able to get through get to his second read. I mean, it was a lot of like one read, pre-snap reads, and let it rip down the sideline. And you mentioned throwing with anticipation. He was able to do that on occasion into those cover 2 holes on the sideline because he felt more comfortable pushing the ball into that portion of the field because he has a howitzer for an arm. Mm-hmm. But working that middle of the field and staying on time, and even that, portions of that Liberty offense, and this is another portion where we already mentioned the Oregon offense. What is the offense asking him to do? What is the scheme asking him to do? Are they asking him to get to his second or third read very often, or is it mostly just kind of like maybe even with Matt Corral, with Lane Kiffin, there was a lot of RPO concepts that were just one read, make it very simple for him, and he has the capabilities of making an RPO read and then on a 5-step glance, just putting it right on him. He could do that. Mm-hmm. And he had some arm talent too that I really liked. It's just, is the offensive scheme masking his deficiencies, or is it holding him back from potentially being able to operate an NFL style offense? Those are the things that we oftentimes don't get in a lot of, maybe a complete grade. But Ian, you hit the nail on the head when it comes to quarterbacks in particular. Like we understand that there's a lot of passing concepts, right? They're endless, and it depends on your scheme that you're in, whether it's like mesh, stick, dagger, Y cross, doubles, Mills concept, like I can go on and on. But so we have the information to understand what generally the progression normally is, but we don't know how that's being coached either. So there's just so much information for a quarterback that we have to take into account. But in particular, the one thing that I look at is pre-snap are they identifying, where potentially they identify their alert, right? For example, like Jaden Daniels, he got a lot of middle field close looks this year. Excuse me. And he ended up throwing a lot of, go routes or slot fades to Malik Neighbors this year because you're getting a pre-snap look of just a middle high safety. I'm throwing that to Malik Neighbors 99 times out of 100 too, if that's my pre-snap look. But the ability to be able to identify the safety rotations too post-snap like when I'm looking at the stripe on their helmet, are their eyes identifying what the safeties are to confirm that it is a middle field open look post snap, or did they rotate into some sort of middle field close cover 3 look post snap to change the progression or change where he needs to go with the football? Are they identifying that type of information post snap consistently to be able to project that they're going to be able to do that at the NFL level? There's just, when it comes to the quarterback process, there is just so much information that you have to take into account to kind of formulate that grade. I almost feel like the physical aspect of it is the easier part because that's the stuff that I can confirm with my eyes. It's that mental processing ability that's very tough to discern at times, whether they're going to be able to consistently do what they did on tape at the next level, or were they a product of their scheme in college? That part is still, sometimes it feels like a mystery, but that's part of what the fun is trying to project what these prospects are going to do at the next level.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a big part of it. And one thing too is like, it's okay for a QB to have solutions schemed for him to an extent, right? Like NFL offenses are like that too. Some plays have not easy solutions, but some plays are designed to go to a certain area, right? So some plays dictate that, but especially for NFL QBs, you need to be a problem solver on your own. That's kind of the tried and true method. It's something we know now, by default. Like if you're going to be a starting quarterback in the NFL with the pressure and the coverage and the overlapping looks that you get from defenses, there are going to be situations where you're going to have to create a solution on your own, whether that's on your first read and you see the wide receiver breaking and you anticipate, whether you read high to low and see an opportunity in the deep third, or whether you have to get to your third read, right, and be patient in the pocket and keep the play alive. You need to be a problem solver on your own, and that requires physical and mental traits to the highest degree. So it's one of those things where with Malik Willis, that was one. And that was another learning experience for me too, because early in the cycle, I'm starting to understand. I understand as well as I ever have now how important it is to just get initial numbers on a guy. You don't have to have a complete final grade in August, but you need to have initial numbers to know where you're at, right? Because Malik Neighbors, I was only really doing final grades at that point, right? So I was
Malik Willis, you mean? Malik Willis.
My bad. Yeah, Malik Willis, man. The Malik and then the S.
Yeah, right.
That's getting me for sure. With Malik Willis, that was a point in my grading career. I'll say career. It's a weird term, grading career. But that was a point in my grading career where I was only really doing final grades, and I was just maintaining an impression and notes of guys for sure. But I was scared to get an initial grade at times because I didn't want to lock in, and that's something that I'm still improving at, not anchoring too hard to early grades, because prospects can change. Your evaluation of them can change, so you need to be flexible and fluid. But at the same time, with Malik Willis and a lot of the mock drafts heading into that offseason, for some of them, my thought process was like, he's super athletic, he's got the arm, the quarterback class is pretty light, what the heck? Let's put him round one, right? That was not the right way to go about it, because then you put the numbers to the grading scale, right? And yes, arm talent, creation capacity, those are two of the most important things. But you have 7 other categories in the operational field. You got processing, mechanics, accuracy and placement, pocket management, decision making, right? So many different mental components that go into QBing, right? And if you score a 9 in those physical components, right, but a 5 or a 4 in everything else, that's going to get you a day 3 grade. That's going to get you a mid to late day 3 grade, right? So, talent is definitely important, but at the same time, there's so much particularly that goes into QB evaluation. You need to have that broad scale approach, and you need to be able to take in more information. And so that's what this down period after the 2024 NFL draft, before the 2025, far before the 2025 cycle is for. It's not just and for young evaluators out there, get the reps. You have to get into the tape to get the reps, right? So you have to be able to do that, but also be aware of what you need to learn. Don't just rush to, put content. You're like, oh, I got to get content out there. Here's what I think, right? No, make sure that you're kind of filtering it through your own understanding and understanding what you need to learn and what you don't know, and keep building on that, right? So that's what this down period is great for. And QB obviously is kind of the main event, right? Every position matters, but quarterback is the one where everything confluxes to that point. And it's such a fun position. It's such a frustrating position to evaluate at times, but it's very fun too. So it's constantly. Let me ask you this: what's one thing that you're hoping to improve in the 2025 NFL draft cycle compared to 2024?
Yeah. So one place that I want to try to improve is trying to identify exactly, where I want to try to pigeonhole a safety prospect.
Oh yeah.
Because there's a lot like in today's NFL, at least projecting to the next level, there's so much value in a safety prospect being able to flex, to play like a kind of a big nickel, like provide run support, but also have the athleticism and the ability to be able to carry a slot receiver or a talented tight end prospect up the vertical plane with a two-way go. So there's so much nuance and so much detail, so much value at that nickel position. And that is one of my favorite studies of anything on the defensive side of the football, are those versatile defenders, your safety prospects, which, that's why I love Cooper DeJean. That's why, because he's such an interesting study. And I see the ability to be able to identify route concepts quickly. We didn't see him a ton in the slot. He did spend a lot of time outside in that Iowa defense. But I saw what I value as far as being able to play between the ears quite well in the secondary, because in the NFL, if you don't have the ability to match concepts or communicate defensively through a ton of switch releases, and in particular motion at the line of scrimmage at the moment of the snap, there is so much that goes into how fluid those responsibilities change along the back end, and that certainly applies in spades to a slot defender. That slot nickel spot is one of the funnest things to try to always learn more and more and more about what goes into playing that position at the highest of levels. Because we even saw Mike Sanders still go in the second round to the Washington Commanders, I believe it was. Second round, correct? He earned second round draft capital. And I think that he projects as a nickel player immediately to start his NFL career out of Michigan. So that position, I think, can really help elevate your defense if you can find a difference maker that can operate out of that slot or nickelback spot at a high level. Yeah,
and it's a fun position because you've definitely got the coverage utility, right? Like if you have a slot receiver or a big tight end, right? And obviously some nickel defenders will be better for that. Mike Sanders still, I wouldn't put him on a tight end, right? Just because the build isn't there. But, if you have a guy with the versatility like Cooper DeJean, if you think that he can play the slot, he's a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, he's physical for sure. So that's an important position to play because you're going to draw those slot receivers, those big slot weapons, and then also at the same time, the proximity of that slot defender to the QB as well. You can be a really nice blitzing threat, especially for those defensive coordinators who like to disguise coverage looks. The McDonald Fangio tree is a big one there. So, it's something that's I think as the NFL continues to evolve on the offensive side of the ball, there's always one tried and true method to win as a defensive unit, and that's disrupt the quarterback. That's make the quarterback uncomfortable, be it with the pressure or the coverage look that you provide, or both, right? So I think the nickel defender is one of those unlocking pieces to that, because again, he can play in coverage against a multitude of body types, or he can rush the passer from depth with that explosion. So if you have the perfect nickel defender, can be a game changer, right? So that's a fun one, and I love that you brought that up, because that's something that I've been thinking about too, especially with this past class, because we had a few guys who really blended the lines between positions, right? Cooper DeJean, obviously, where are you going to grade him? Corner, safety? I put him at safety as well, but he played corner for most of his collegiate career. So where do you project him? Corner, safety? You think he's going to play nickel? Darius Robinson, who went round 1 to the Cardinals, was another one, right? Who played defensive tackle for most of his career at Missouri. And then once Missouri lost Isaiah McGuire, kicked outside to 7-tech and 9-tech for a lot of the time, and actually had some pretty good reps around the edge too. So where do you play that guy? Situational basis. Brandon Dorless from Oregon was another example. So I think, especially on the defensive side of the ball, two positions that tend to blend the lines a little bit more: defensive line and defensive back, because as the defenses in the league start to evolve more and more, we are seeing more of that schematic versatility. Like, yeah, maybe on early downs, you can play 5-tech, strong side defensive end, and then rotate inside to 3-tech on passing downs. But then all of a sudden he's taking some reps at 7-tech too with that speed to power. Where do you put a guy like that? What position do you grade him at? And then it goes the same for corner and safety. Like, some guys can play safety a little bit, nickel, corner, how do you project those players? So that's a question that I don't have a defined answer for yet, but it's tough, man. It's really tough to putting us in a bind, but it's fun to explore it. And I've been thinking about, a grading scale that blends those a little bit more, right? And maybe just the tough part for me is the size score, right? Because depending on how you grade them, whether it's a corner or safety or defensive tackle or an edge, your size score and how you grade the profile, the body type is going to be a little bit different. So how do you weigh that? It's the biggest thing for me. But the roles there is some role overlap, and maybe that helps, I guess.
I'm not saying we're moving towards positionless football on the defensive side, because of course you're always going to have your big space eaters up front. You're going to have your defensive linemen, but really I think that there is some blurring of the line between, even the safety and some nickel linebackers, like just being able to demand movement in space. Yeah. I mean, we've seen some hybrid / versatile safeties have a lot of success in the right system. And then we've seen incredible athletes like Isaiah Simmons kind of fall into like a positionless wasteland and not really have a defined role.
Like limbo or whatever.
I saw Isaiah Simmons and Kyle Hamilton. I liked both of their games coming out of college, but we see that one's an all-pro in the right scheme. And then we see Isaiah Simmons, who hasn't really even still found a home in an NFL defense. So, trying to project these versatile athletic defenders is an interesting process that is I'm always having to kind of go back and retool exactly how I'm grading these prospects and what fits they could fall into in an NFL defensive scheme. It's very interesting on the defensive side of the football, in particular, kind of like those linebacker, because a lot of linebackers too, I don't know about you, and this is another maybe talking point. Mm-hmm. What are we to make of how fast but undersized the linebacker position is getting? At least the amount of prospects that they are pumping into the NFL, they're a little bit smaller and undersized in the traditional linebacker sense, but how the game is demanding that linebackers be able to check in zone coverage or out of the backfield against these, exceptional athletes that are pretty much a converted wide receiver playing running back, creating mismatches in the passing game on third down situations. How do we process the evolution of today's linebacker position in the NFL?
Yeah, and that's another one too, where that might eventually trickle over to the grading scale, particularly for running backs, right? Like, I think if you have a lighter linebacker in the box, 225, 230 pounds, maybe we're going to go back to ground and pound a little bit, 80s, 90s 90s football where we just got a volume back who's just too big to take down one-on-one, get him in space, solid 6 to 7 yards every time, keeps the offense moving, keeps them on the field, and keeps the defense tired. I think it's one of those things where, football is always an endless tug of war, right? So I think that, the offense will get that edge, defenses will start to push back. But you're right, it does seem like there's more of an influx of the prototype that's below 230 pounds, sub 230, and how our offense is going to change to counter that, because that to me looks like something to expose, right? Something to take advantage of, because there's definitely not that level of solidity on the second level that we've seen in the past, with guys who were 250 pounds, block a rock, who would just halt second level blocks with ease. So that's going to be a fun one to explore, I think. I don't know if we have the answer yet right now.
We don't.
But it's one of those things where, I'd be very intrigued to see if we just see, and people say the ground game is going to come back. It's always been there. Football has always been a balance of the run in the pass. My philosophy has always been you pass to get ahead, right? You got to be proactive in taking the lead. And then once you have a good lead, you run to stay ahead. You play ball control. You don't let the other team get back in it, right? So I think that's always that's the ideal balance that you want to strike. So I don't think teams are going to run just to run, right? There are a few guys that will to set the tone, set the identity, right? But I do wonder if that's going to become a more, and it's always been important, running the ball has always been important within that facet, but I wonder if teams are going to be able to lean on it a little bit more because of that weakness that you can exploit with the personnel deficiencies at the linebacker position. So it's going to be a fun one to explore, and I think that goes into my next question for you. Real quick, one thing I want to improve on for the next cycle is just identifying run schemes and formations a little bit better. I feel like I've been improving on that side of it for sure. But now that I feel like we both got the trait identifying down pretty well, right? Evaluation is always a balance of identifying traits. Yeah, no, Derek, you are phenomenal. You are exceptional. But so, I think that, it's an evaluation of identifying traits and skill sets, but then also at a certain level, you need to be able to kind of channel that through the football schematics that are on the film, right? Because every different play asks something different of a player, right? So to understand how that player's traits lends them to success, you have to understand what they're being asked of on a given play. One play that caught my eye this past cycle, and I hit up Dalton, my buddy Dalton, who was on the podcast a few months ago on Twitter, just via DM. I sent him a clip. I was like, hey, what kind of run scheme is this? Because it was Penn State. And it was Hunter Norzad, and it was a running play where the left tackle and the left guard had down blocks, I think, so just kind of blocking down on their man. And then I think one of the guards I think the guards had reach blocks. I can't remember the exact play, but Hunter Norzad, the center, was the one who caught my eye, because at the center position, you're the fulcrum of the line. You're at the middle, and off the snap, he hinged all the way out beyond the right tackle to pick off the pursuit defender on the backside. Wow. I've never seen a center do that. Rarely seen a center do that. So I'm like, what kind of scheme is that, right? And I think it was GT counter again, because that's when you have some guys moving across the line. So, but I want to be able to identify those a little bit quicker, right? Because once you identify that, and that, okay, what's being asked of this player on a GT counter or a zone scheme or a duo scheme, right? What's being asked of them, and what traits do you need to pull that off? Because Hunter Norzad on that play, that was one play where I was like, all right, well, he's got the necessary athleticism for sure, because he's getting out of the stance. He's traversing two gaps and he's reaching the guy. Maybe not an elite athlete, but definitely good enough to be a starter.
That's good enough.
Exactly. So that's an example where you can, if you identify a scheme and identify the duties of a player within that scheme and whether they're able to fulfill that can help your projection at the NFL level. So
immensely.
That's one thing that I'm still learning, right? Because I don't have a big football background. I played tennis in high school, okay, which that ironically enough, that has helped me a little bit with certain mechanical things. But, I think that, at a certain level as an evaluator, you do need to level up your football knowledge, right? You can always identify traits and some like arm elasticity and arm talent, like we were talking about. You can see that on film. You don't have to be a football aficionado to see that. But at a certain level, to adequately grade a player and his projectability within the football lens, you got to be able to identify those things. So that's one thing that I want to improve a little bit. But we got around 5 minutes. We can go a little bit over. I'm having fun. We can go a little bit over. But my next question for you is, and and I forgot. I totally forgot.
I wanted to touch on the rushing concepts though. I mean, there's so much that goes into. I mean, there's a reason why playing offensive line is such a detailed position, right? Because there's movement at the snap, which changes your assignments on the go, right? So these offensive linemen, depending on whether it's gap or zone scheme, and you're going to have your variances of, you know, offensive scheme and you know, kind of the infrastructure of what offenses like to do on that side of the football, depending on whatever scheme that they have. Like you're going to see a lot of gap scheme, like you said, a lot of GT counter. You're going to see a lot of duo. You're going to see a lot of power in you know, someone like Greg Roman's scheme, and then you're going to see your zone schemes, your inside zone, outside zone, wide zone. Split zone, you know, all kinds of different concepts, and get into those different formations and, you know, change the assignments with motion at the snap, both on the offensive side of the ball, but also defenses changing their alignment right at the offensive, at the moment of the snap. You know, these offensive linemen being able to process that information and still get to their assignments and even not only do combo blocks, but then get up to the next level or reach blocks. So much goes into it. And I mean, that's why I understand why some folks maybe didn't love the pick of Jordan Morgan for the Green Bay Packers, but I actually think from a scheme fit, Morgan fits really well for what the Green Bay Packers want to do as far as trying to run the football. Yeah,
for sure. And it's one, and that in turn is another thing where that can help you. If you identify the schematic preferences for a given player, that can help you with player team fits in the January to March stretch, right? Because that's the area, you know, you want to be mock drafts are meant to be exploratory. Like you can do whatever you want, but at the same time, some teams do have player prototype preferences, thresholds that they need to hit, right? And so, you know, once you have an understanding of those things, then how a player can be weaponized within his own scheme in college and how they used him best, that can help you narrow down the list of team fits. And more often than not, you know, you can at least whittle it down a little bit. We never know what's going to happen to the full extent, but you can get closer with that. It's another thing that helps guide you in the right direction. So with our last remaining time here, I remembered the question when we were talking. I remembered it. I forgot it, and then I remembered it. Looking ahead for the 2024 NFL draft class, because we've got them in their landing spots. We know which teams they're going to. What case studies are you looking forward to following that could help your evaluation in the future? For me, it's the wide receiver position, and just kind of, I know it's kind of cliche, right? But there's always been, especially in recent years, there's been kind of a dichotomy between the smaller, faster receivers who can separate, and then the bigger guys who might not be able to separate as well, but are good at the catch point, contested threats. So I think the question has always been, what traits can you identify in bigger guys that can help them grow and survive as separators at the next level, and what prevents them from doing that, right? So two guys in particular that I'm really looking forward to following: Keon Coleman with Buffalo, and then Xavier Legette with Carolina. Yeah, because Keon Coleman, man, we watched him on tape in college, and he's an alpha at the catch point. He's got enough explosion, right? And he's got good play pace, even if his 40 wasn't the fastest. But I know you were experimenting with a move to the big slot for him, but he's in Buffalo now, and they drafted Dalton Kincaid to do that role, right? So he's going to be asked to be that wide receiver one. Does he have the requisite route running building blocks, the fluidity, the flexibility, the cutting ability, and the foot speed, and then also just the hip flexibility at stems to pull that off? And can he do it, right? And then Xavier Legette as well. The athletic profile is there. We know Carolina literally just drafted Jonathan Mingo last year, who had a similar athletic profile, but I do think they're different prospects. So what does Legette have that allows him to be this wide receiver one? And can he be that wide receiver one, right? So that's another thing that I'm very anxious to see, because I think both of those guys in particular entered situations where a lot will be asked of them pretty early on, right? So can they do that? Do they have the requisite traits for their size to pull that off? And if they don't, what were the traits that they lacked, and how can we look for that a little bit better in the future? So those are the two case studies that I'm really looking forward to seeing. What's at the top of your mind there?
Oh, that you took the words right out of my mouth. I'm so interested to see how this receiver group and their potential roles, because it seemed like I was super high on some of these elite separators, in particular with like Ladd McConkey and Adonai Mitchell, and yet we saw those big bodied receivers that have that physical profile that projects as a potential option as an X receiver out on the outside in Keon Coleman and Xavier Legette, both go off the board prior to them, and even Brian Thomas Jr., right? So I'm very interested to see if what I'm valuing, which I value so much more, Ian, the folks that can consistently create separation heading into the NFL and that have formation versatility, like your Ricky Pearsalls, I think Ladd McConkey can operate, whether it's on the outside or in the slot. Same thing with now Adonai Mitchell is kind of more outside, but his movement and separation skills are I valued higher than Keon Coleman, because I think that honestly, if you're asking Coleman just to operate on the outside, I would rather have Adonai Mitchell in that Buffalo offense, because I think he has more ready-made skills to be able to create separation consistently on the perimeter than that of Keon Coleman. We're going to see how it works out. But yeah, this wide receiver group is going, and even Jalen Polk with the New England Patriots, right? I'm very interested to see
I wasn't going to let you off the hook if you didn't mention Polk. I'm sorry. No,
I had to let you. Hey, you brought up Coleman and you brought up Leggett. I was like, well, we got to talk about Polk too, right? No, I mean, it's something where this crop of wide receivers and where they're on their offenses and what the roles that are projected for these players, even Malachi Corley with the New York Jets. I'm very interested to see how they're utilized in their respective offensive schemes, and if it matched up to how I prioritize separation, STEM IQ, and being able to win at the break point.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. I know wide receiver valuation in particular is one that's always very heavily under the microscope, definitely because of the fantasy implications, right? It's something that people are paying attention to a lot, but also just in the modern NFL, if you have a wide receiver grouping that can stress defenses, like we talked a little bit about that on the last podcast 2 weeks ago, like the Bears, right? Teams that have three guys who can really play off each other very well, that can be dangerous. So having that can be an asset for an NFL team and NFL offense. So I'm very excited to look at that. Just this class in general, man. I think there's a lot of potential learning opportunities down the road. So it'll be fun to follow that and see what happens. But that's all the time we got for you today. Thank you, as always, for listening to us. We're back after a short vacation, and we will be back for once each week in the ensuing weeks. We'll have more post-2024 NFL Draft and pre-2025 NFL Draft cycle content for you. We will have more scouting reports coming up on PFN, and we will have plenty of draft content coming in the weeks and months to follow. Thank you, as always, for listening. For Derek Tate, I'm Ian Cummings. Peace out. Have a good one.